Some names don't disappear. They just wait for the right moment to return. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and quiet regret, the kind that settled into walls and never quite left, and Emily Carter sat perfectly still in the corner chair, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of a thin paper gown as if holding on to something real, something steady. After years of avoiding this place, after years of choosing anything but this, the soft hum of fluorescent lights above her blending with the faint, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor in the next room, steady, indifferent, alive, just like the past she had buried 6 years ago, the past she told herself no longer mattered, the past she had learned to carry without looking at directly, and yet today, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she had walked through those glass doors, signed her name on a clipboard, and said yes when they asked if she was ready to be seen, even though nothing about her felt ready, not her hands, not her breath, not the quiet storm moving behind her calm expression. And, when the nurse finally called, "Miss Carter?" Her name sounded unfamiliar in the air, like it belonged to someone else, someone braver, someone less afraid, and Emily stood, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her sleeve, taking slow, measured steps down the hallway lined with closed doors and distant voices, each footstep echoing just a little too loud, each second stretching longer than it should, until she reached the room and sat again, this time on the narrow exam table, her gaze fixed on the floor, on the clean white tiles that reflected nothing back, and for a moment everything was still, no sound, no movement, just breath in and out, steady, controlled, practiced, until the handle turned, a soft click barely noticeable, and the door opened and she looked up without thinking, without preparing, without guarding herself the way she always did. And that was when it happened, that was when time broke, because standing there, holding her chart with one hand, flipping a page with the other, was a man she had spent years trying to forget, a face she had memorized once in a different life, in a different version of herself, Dr. Daniel Hayes, older now, sharper, composed in a way that came from power and distance and everything she had never had, his white coat pristine, his watch catching the light as he moved, unaware, completely unaware, and Emily's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, her fingers tightening slowly against the paper beneath her, not enough to make a sound, just enough to feel it, and for a second, just 1 second, she thought he might look up and recognize her too, but he didn't, not yet, his eyes scanning the chart, calm, clinical, detached, until something made him pause, just slightly. Just enough, his brow narrowing as he read a line again. And then, finally, he lifted his gaze and their eyes met, and everything that had been buried, hidden, renamed, and rewritten rose quietly back to the surface without a single word. Daniel did not speak right away, and neither did she, the air between them tightening into something fragile and sharp, like glass that had not shattered yet but could at any second, and for the first time since he walked in, his professional rhythm faltered just slightly, just enough for it to be noticeable if someone was watching closely, but there was no one else here, just him and her and 6 years of silence pressing quietly against the walls, his eyes searching her face with a focus that was no longer clinical, no longer detached but uncertain, almost cautious, as if something deep in his memory was shifting without permission. "Have we met before?" he asked finally, his voice steady but slower than before, and Emily felt the question settle over her like a weight she had carried for too long, her back straightening just a little, her chin lifting by instinct, not in defiance but in control, the kind she had learned to build piece by piece over years of being unseen. "No," she said, her tone calm, even practiced, the kind of answer that closed doors instead of opening them, and Daniel nodded once, almost automatically, but something in his expression did not follow that agreement, something lingered, something stayed, his gaze dropping back to the chart in his hands as if searching for confirmation in black and white, something objective, something that could explain why a stranger felt familiar, and that was when he saw it again, the line that had made him pause. "Emergency birth 6 years ago," he read silently this time, his fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the paper, and without meaning to, his eyes flicked back up to her, sharper now, more present. "You have a child?" he asked, and Emily's breath caught for the briefest moment before she answered, "Yes," just one word, soft but firm, enough to acknowledge, not enough to explain, and Daniel hesitated, something in his posture shifting, less distant now, more aware. "Any complications since then?" he continued, but the question felt thinner, less important than what was building underneath it, and Emily shook her head gently. "No," her voice steady, her hands still resting in her lap, though her fingers had curled slightly inward, as if holding on to something invisible, and for a moment it almost returned to normal, almost became just another appointment, just another patient, just another day, until the small silver locket slipped from her fingers, quiet but unmistakable as it hit the tiled floor and opened on impact. The faint click echoing louder than it should have, and both of them looked down at the same time, the same instinct, the same pull, and inside, pressed between worn edges, was a faded ultrasound image, the black and white shape blurred with time but still recognizable, still undeniable, and Daniel felt something shift in his chest, something he could not name yet, his breath slowing, his hand lowering the chart without realizing it. "That is," he started, but the words did not finish, because something else had caught his eye, a name partially visible. In the corner of the image, his name, not written clearly, not fully displayed, but enough to stop everything, enough to make the room feel smaller, quieter, heavier. And when he looked back up at her, truly looked this time, there was no longer just curiosity in his eyes, there was recognition trying to surface, fragile, incomplete, but there, and Emily did not look away, she did not flinch, she did not break, she simply held his gaze with a calm that had cost her years to build, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need confirmation, something that had been waiting longer than either of them had admitted. Daniel did not bend to pick up the locket right away, and neither did Emily, as if both of them understood that the moment it was touched, something irreversible would follow, something neither of them had fully prepared to face, the silence stretching longer now, heavier, no longer uncertain but charged, and finally, slowly, Daniel crouched down, his movements careful, controlled, the way he approached every delicate situation. But this was different. This was not a patient, not a diagnosis, not something he could explain with charts and data. His fingers closing gently around the small silver frame before he lifted it, his eyes never leaving the image inside. The faded ultrasound, the faint outline of life captured in grainy black and white, and then the detail that stopped him completely, the partial name, the date, the timeline aligning too precisely to ignore. His breath tightening as something deeper, something older began to surface, fragments of memory breaking through the careful order he had built his life upon. A rainy night, a hospital corridor that felt too quiet, a woman who had disappeared before morning, a choice he had justified, a chapter he had sealed, and now, standing in front of him was the consequence of everything he had chosen not to remember. And when he stood again, the locket still open in his hand, his composure was no longer untouched. There was a crack now, small but visible. "Emily." He said her name slowly, as if testing it, as if confirming something he was no longer able to deny, and this time she did not correct him, did not look away, did not retreat into distance. She simply watched him, steady, grounded, her silence no longer defensive but intentional, and Daniel swallowed, his gaze shifting between her and the image, between the present and the past that was rewriting itself in real time. "Why did you not tell me?" The question came out quieter than he expected, not accusing, not even demanding, just confused, almost searching, and Emily's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened, not with forgiveness, not yet, but with truth, the kind that did not need to be raised or forced. "I tried," she said, her voice low but clear, every word measured, every word earned. "You had already moved on, and your assistant made that very clear." And Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization, pieces connecting in ways he could not undo, and for the first time, he looked not like a man in control, but like someone standing at the edge of something he did not understand, something he could not manage with authority or distance. "The child," he began, his voice catching just enough to betray what he was trying to contain, "is mine." And it was not a question, not anymore, and Emily nodded once, small, certain, as if she had answered that question long ago and had simply been waiting for him to arrive at it on his own, and the room seemed to shift again, the quiet becoming something else, something fuller, heavier with meaning. And Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that felt unfamiliar even to himself, his world, so structured, so predictable, now rearranging around a truth that had existed long before this moment. "Where is he?" he asked, softer now, no longer as a doctor, no longer as a stranger, but as something he was only beginning to understand, and Emily's gaze moved briefly toward the door, just for a second before returning to him. And in that single glance, everything changed again, because somewhere beyond that thin wall, beyond the quiet hallway, footsteps echoed, light, quick, unmistakably small, and Daniel's heart, steady just moments ago, shifted into something entirely new as the sound drew closer. The sound of footsteps grew louder, quick and uneven, the kind that carried curiosity instead of caution, and before either of them could speak again, the door pushed open just enough for a small figure to slip through, a boy no older than 6, his sneakers barely making a sound against the tile, his eyes wide as he looked around the unfamiliar room before landing on Emily. "Mom?" he asked, his voice soft but clear, and something in the way he said it shifted the entire space, grounding it, making everything real in a way that words never could, and Emily's expression changed for the first time, not breaking but softening, her shoulders easing just slightly as she stepped forward, instinct replacing restraint. "I told you to wait outside, Lucas," she said gently, though there was no real correction in her tone, only quiet concern, and the boy nodded, but his attention had already moved, drawn by the presence of someone new, someone unfamiliar, and slowly, almost cautiously, Lucas turned his head toward Daniel, studying him with the kind of open curiosity that only children carried, unfiltered, unguarded, and Daniel stood there completely still, the chart forgotten in one hand, the locket still open in the other, as he looked at the boy who had just entered his life without warning, without permission, without preparation, and for a moment, he did not see details, not the color of his shirt or the scuff on his shoes, but something deeper, something immediate, the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, the way he stood slightly angled as if unsure whether to step forward or stay back, familiar in a way that bypassed logic entirely, and Daniel's breath caught again, quieter this time, more controlled but no less significant. "Hi," Lucas said after a second, polite, a little unsure, the way he had probably been taught, and Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first, because there were no rehearsed words for this, no professional script, no distance he could hide behind, just a moment that demanded honesty before he was ready to give it, and finally he managed, "Hi," his voice softer than it had been all day, almost unrecognizable even to himself, and Lucas glanced back at Emily, then at Daniel again, sensing something without understanding it. Children always did. "Are you my mom's doctor?" he asked, simple, direct, and Emily's hand tightened slightly at her side, just for a second before she answered, "Yes," her voice steady, though her eyes had not left Daniel's face, watching, measuring, waiting, and Daniel felt the weight of that answer settle into him, heavier than anything he had carried before, because it was not just a role, not just a title, it was a distance, a boundary, a version of the truth that was easier to say but impossible to keep, and Lucas nodded, accepting it without question, stepping a little closer now, his small hand brushing against the edge of the exam table as he looked up at Daniel again, more curious than cautious now. "You look like me," he said, not as an accusation, not even as a realization, just as an observation, honest and unfiltered, and the room fell into silence once more, deeper this time, undeniable, and Daniel felt something shift inside him in a way that no diagnosis, no success, no carefully built life had ever managed to do. Something quiet but irreversible, and when he looked at Emily again there was no longer just recognition in his eyes, there was responsibility, unfamiliar, unchosen but real, and Emily did not look away. She simply held his gaze, calm, unwavering, as if she had been standing in this moment alone for years, waiting not for answers, but for him to finally see what had always been there. Daniel did not respond to the boy's words right away, but something in his expression shifted, subtle yet undeniable, as if a truth had settled into place without asking for permission, and Lucas, unaware of the weight he had just introduced, tilted his head slightly, studying him with open curiosity, the kind that did not carry judgment, only observation, and Emily stepped closer, her presence quiet but steady, placing a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder, not to pull him away, but to anchor him, to remind both of them that this moment, as unexpected as it was, still belonged to her, still followed the boundaries she had built over 6 years of doing this alone. "Lucas," she said softly, her voice calm, controlled, but layered with something deeper, something protective. "Why do not you wait just outside for a minute?" And the boy looked up at her, hesitating for a second, his eyes flicking between her and Daniel again, sensing something more than he could understand, but trusting her enough not to question it. "Okay," he said finally, nodding once before turning toward the door, his small steps echoing lightly as he left, the door closing with a quiet click that felt louder than it should have, and suddenly, the room felt different again, emptier, but not lighter, no heavier, because now there was no distraction, no buffer, just the two of them and everything that had been said without being spoken, and Daniel exhaled slowly, setting the chart down on the counter beside him as if it no longer held the answers he needed, the locket still resting in his hand, open, undeniable. "He is 6, he said, not as a question, but as a realization that had taken form in front of him, and Emily nodded, her gaze steady. 6 years 3 months, she replied, precise, as if every day had been counted, remembered, carried, and Daniel closed his eyes for just a moment, a brief, controlled pause before opening them again, this time without distance, without the clinical barrier he had relied on for so long. "I did not know," he said, and there was no defense in it, no attempt to justify or explain, just a simple truth that sounded smaller than it should have, and Emily watched him carefully, not with anger, not even with accusation, but with the clarity of someone who had already lived through the consequences of that sentence. "I know," she answered, and the 2 words held more weight than anything louder could have carried, because they were not forgiveness, they were acknowledgement, and Daniel's hand tightened slightly around the locket before he gently closed it, placing it on the edge of the table between them, not keeping it, not returning it fully, just letting it rest there, shared, visible, real. "Why now?" he asked quietly, his voice lower, more careful, as if each word mattered more than before, and Emily took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling almost imperceptibly. "Because avoiding it does not make it disappear," she said, her tone calm but firm, the kind of truth that had been tested over time, and Daniel nodded once, absorbing that, not arguing, not questioning, just understanding in a way that felt unfamiliar, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer tense but full, as if something had shifted from hidden to seen, and Daniel finally looked toward the door, where Lucas had disappeared, his gaze lingering there just a second longer than necessary before returning to Emily. "I do not want to be a stranger to him," he said, and this time it was not a statement of authority, not a demand, but something closer to a request, uncertain, unpolished, real, and Emily held his gaze, steady as always, but this time there was a question in hers too, quiet but present, because for the first time the choice was no longer only hers. Emily did not answer him immediately, and the pause that followed was not hesitation but measurement, the kind that came from years of making decisions alone, decisions that could not afford to be wrong, her gaze steady on his, searching not for words but for weight, for something beneath what he had just said, because wanting was easy, she had learned that long ago, but staying was something else entirely, something far rarer, and Daniel did not look away this time, did not retreat behind distance or professionalism, he simply stood there, waiting, allowing the silence to hold him in place instead of escaping it, and finally Emily spoke, her voice calm, even but layered with a quiet firmness that did not need to be raised. "He does not need promises," she said, her eyes unwavering. "He needs consistency." And Daniel nodded slowly, the words settling deeper than they sounded, because they were not instructions, they were boundaries, drawn carefully over years he had not been part of. And he understood that. Now, not fully, not yet, but enough to know this was not something he could approach the way he had approached everything else in his life. There would be no shortcuts here, no control, no immediate resolution, only time, only presence, only proof, and he exhaled softly, a breath that seemed to carry more than just air. "Then I will show him," he replied, his voice quiet but certain, not polished, not rehearsed, just honest in a way that felt unfamiliar even to himself, and Emily watched him. For a moment longer, as if weighing the shape of that sentence, not accepting it, not rejecting it, simply acknowledging that it had been said. And then she turned slightly toward the door, her posture shifting just enough to signal a change, a decision made. "Lucas," she called gently, her voice carrying through the thin barrier, and within seconds the door opened again, the boy stepping back inside with the same quiet curiosity, though now there was something else in his expression. Something more aware, as if he understood that the room he had left was not the same one he was returning to, and he walked closer to Emily, his hand finding hers naturally, instinctively, grounding himself in the one constant he had always known, and Daniel felt that small movement more than he expected, the simplicity of it, the certainty of it, and for a moment, he realized just how much he had missed without ever knowing it, and Emily looked down at Lucas, her expression softening just slightly before she spoke. "This is Dr. Hayes," she said, choosing her words carefully, not rushing, not revealing more than necessary, and Lucas looked up at Daniel again, studying him with the same open honesty, but now with something else layered in, curiosity shaped by awareness. "Hi again," he said, quieter this time, and Daniel stepped forward just a fraction, not too close, not too fast, mindful in a way he had never needed to be before. "Hi, Lucas," he replied, and saying the boy's name felt different than anything else he had said that day, heavier, more real, and Lucas tilted his head slightly, then asked, "Are you going to help my mom?" And the question landed simply, without weight in his voice, but with everything in its meaning, and Daniel glanced briefly at Emily before answering, not for permission, but for alignment, and then he looked back at Lucas, steady, present. "Yes," he said, and this time the word carried more than its sound, because for the first time, helping meant more than doing a job, more than following a role. It meant stepping into something he had not chosen before, something he now understood he could no longer walk away from, and Emily watched him closely, her expression unchanged, but her silence different now, not guarded, not distant, but open just enough to allow what came next to begin. Daniel did not move any closer after answering, but something in the room had already shifted, subtle yet undeniable, like the air had changed pressure, and Lucas seemed to feel it too, his small hand still wrapped around Emily's, but his eyes drifting back to Daniel again, studying him with quiet interest, as if trying to understand why this man, this stranger, suddenly mattered more than the others they had passed in hallways or waiting rooms. And Emily gently guided Lucas to sit beside her, on the edge of the exam table, her hand resting lightly on his back, steady, reassuring, while her gaze returned to Daniel, calm but observant, as if every movement, every word from this point forward would be remembered, weighed, and measured against something far greater than this moment. And Daniel understood that without being told, the awareness settling into his posture as he picked up the chart again, not to hide behind it, but to ground himself in something familiar, something structured. "I am going to check a few things, okay?" he said, his voice softer now, directed toward Lucas, not as a doctor speaking to a patient, but as someone learning how to speak to a child who was no longer just a name on paper. And Lucas nodded, accepting easily, his legs swinging slightly as he sat, the rhythm small but steady, and Daniel stepped closer, careful, deliberate, his movements slower than usual, as if giving space for adjustment, for trust to form in small, unnoticed ways. And as he gently checked Lucas's pulse, his breathing, simple things, routine things, he found himself paying attention to details he had never noticed before, the warmth of the boy's skin, the quiet steadiness of his heartbeat, the way Lucas watched him without fear, only curiosity, and something about that lack of fear made everything feel heavier because it meant trust had been given without being earned, and Daniel felt the weight of that in a way no responsibility had ever felt before. And when he finished, he stepped back slightly, giving space again, his gaze shifting briefly to Emily, who had not looked away once, her expression unchanged but her presence unwavering, a constant he was only beginning to understand. And then Lucas spoke again, his voice breaking the quiet in the most natural way. "Are you going to see us again?" he asked, simple, direct, the kind of question that did not carry layers for him, but carried everything for the adults in the room. And Daniel did not answer immediately, not because he did not want to, but because this answer mattered in a way others never had. There was no room here for uncertainty, no space for something half-meant or easily forgotten, and he looked at Emily for just a second, not asking, not seeking approval, but acknowledging that this was no longer just his decision alone. And then he looked back at Lucas, steady, present. "Yes," he said, and this time the word did not feel small. It felt like a beginning, quiet but real, and Lucas smiled, just a little, satisfied with that answer in the way only a child could be, accepting it fully without needing proof. And Emily's hand tightened slightly against Lucas's shoulder, not pulling him closer, but grounding herself in the moment. And when she looked at Daniel again, there was something different in her eyes, not trust, not yet, but the smallest shift away from distance, as if for the first time she was allowing the possibility that this might not end the same way it had before. And Daniel felt that shift, not as relief but as responsibility, something he could not ignore, something he could not walk away from. And in the quiet that followed, the room no longer felt like a place of discovery, but the beginning of something that would require more than words to hold together. The room settled into a quieter rhythm after Lucas's small smile faded into calm, the kind of quiet that no longer felt tense but carried weight in a different way, something more grounded, more real. And Daniel turned slightly toward the counter, picking up his pen with a movement that was slower than usual, more deliberate, as if even the smallest action now needed intention, and he began writing notes on the chart. But his focus was no longer only on the medical details, no longer confined to numbers or observations. It stretched beyond that, into something less measurable, something he could not document or file away, and Emily watched him without interrupting, her presence steady, her posture relaxed but alert, as if she had learned long ago how to exist in moments that could shift without warning. And Lucas, sitting beside her, swung his legs gently, the soft rhythm filling the silence in a way that felt almost grounding, almost normal. And Daniel paused after a moment, glancing up again, his gaze moving between them, not quickly, not analytically but carefully, as if committing something to memory, and then he spoke, his voice calm, measured. "He is healthy," he said, the words simple but reassuring, and Emily nodded once, not surprised, but still receiving the confirmation with quiet acceptance. "He has always been," she replied, and there was something in her tone that carried pride without needing to show it, the kind that came from years of doing something right without recognition, and Daniel absorbed that, his expression softening just slightly, because he understood now that what he was seeing was not just a child, not just a patient, but the result of choices he had not been there to make, of care he had not been part of, and that realization settled into him in a way that felt both heavy and clarifying, and Lucas leaned forward a little, curious again, his eyes moving to the chart in Daniel's hands. "What are you writing?" he asked. And Daniel hesitated just briefly before answering. "Just making sure everything about you is recorded correctly." And Lucas nodded, satisfied with that explanation, though he did not fully understand it, and Emily's gaze shifted to Daniel again, more direct this time. "You do not have to take over anything," she said quietly, her words steady, not defensive, not distant, just clear. "He already has a life." And Daniel looked at her, really looked, and nodded slowly, understanding what she meant, not just the surface of it, but the deeper line it drew. This was not about stepping in, not about replacing or claiming, it was about joining something that already existed, something that did not need him to be complete, and that truth, while difficult, felt honest in a way he could not ignore. "I know," he said, and his voice carried something new now, not just intention but acceptance. "I am not here to change that." And Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, as if testing the weight of that sentence, and then she nodded once, small but significant, and the room shifted again, not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough to be felt, as if a line had been crossed quietly, carefully, and Daniel placed the chart down, stepping back slightly, giving them space without leaving entirely, a balance he was only beginning to understand, and Lucas looked between them again, sensing something he could not name, but no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, just present, and Daniel realized then that this was not a moment that would resolve quickly, not something that would end with a single conversation or a single decision. This was something that would unfold slowly, over time, through actions that would need to match words, through presence that could not disappear. And as he stood there watching them, he understood for the first time that the life he had built, structured and controlled, had just expanded into something unpredictable, something that required more than certainty, more than control, something that required him to stay, not because it was expected, but because it mattered. The moment did not end when the conversation slowed, it only shifted into something quieter, something that lingered beneath every movement, and Emily stood slowly, guiding Lucas down from the exam table with a gentle hand, her motions calm and practiced, as if she had done this 100 times before, because she had, just not like this, never with someone else watching, never with someone who now carried a place in the story she had built alone. And Daniel stepped back slightly to give them space, but his eyes did not leave them, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of something deeper, something that felt like awareness settling into place. And as Emily adjusted Lucas's jacket, smoothing the collar with a small, familiar gesture, Daniel noticed the details, the quiet care, the consistency she had spoken about, not in words but in actions repeated over years, and it became clear to him that he was not stepping into something empty. He was stepping into something already complete, something that did not need him, and that realization did not push him away, it grounded him, because for the first time, he understood that his presence would have to be earned, not assumed. And Lucas looked up at Emily, then back at Daniel, his expression thoughtful now, more observant than before. "Are we done?" he asked, and Emily nodded gently. "Yes, we are done for today," she said, her voice soft, steady, and Lucas turned toward Daniel again, giving a small wave, simple, natural. "Bye, Dr. Hayes," he said, and Daniel felt something tighten in his chest at the formality of it, the distance it created, a title instead of a connection, and he nodded in return, managing a quiet, "Goodbye, Lucas," though the word goodbye felt wrong, too final for something that had just begun, and Emily reached for the locket on the table, closing it carefully before slipping it back into her hand, not hiding it, but holding it, and as she turned toward the door, she paused for just a second, her hand resting on the handle, her posture still, and Daniel felt the moment stretch again, fragile, undefined, and then she looked back at him, not fully, just enough, her eyes meeting his with the same calm clarity she had held from the beginning. "We come here every 6 months, she said, her voice even, not offering, not inviting, just stating a fact, but the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was not a closed door either, and Daniel nodded once, slowly, understanding exactly what she had given him. Not access, not trust, but time. A chance measured not in words, but in presence, and Emily opened the door, guiding Lucas out into the hallway, their footsteps fading gradually, the sound soft but real, and Daniel remained where he was, standing in the quiet room that no longer felt the same, the chart still resting on the counter, the air still carrying the weight of everything that had shifted, and after a moment, he moved, stepping toward the door, not rushing, not calling out, just walking with intention, because for the first time, he was not thinking about what had happened, he was thinking about what would come next, and as he reached the doorway, he could still hear Lucas's voice echo faintly down the hall, light, unburdened, and something about that sound anchored him, not to the past he had lost, but to the future he now had the chance to be part of, if he chose to stay. The hallway felt longer than it had before as Daniel stepped out of the room, the quiet hum of the clinic returning around him, but nothing sounded the same anymore. Every footstep, every distant voice, every door closing carried a different weight, and ahead, he could still see them, Emily and Lucas, moving toward the exit with the same steady rhythm, the same quiet coordination that spoke of routine, of a life built without interruption, and for a moment Daniel stopped walking, not because he hesitated, but because he understood that what came next could not be rushed. This was not a moment to reclaim, not a situation to control. This was something that required a different kind of movement, slower, intentional, earned, and he watched as Lucas said something to Emily, something light that made her glance down at him with a small, almost hidden smile, the kind that appeared without effort, the kind that came from familiarity, and Daniel felt that detail settle into him, not as distance but as something to respect, something to learn, and after a breath, he continued forward, his pace measured, not trying to catch up, just closing the space enough to be present, enough to not disappear. And when they reached the front doors, Emily pushed them open, the outside light spilling in brighter, warmer, a contrast to the controlled calm of the clinic, and Lucas stepped out first, his energy shifting immediately, freer, lighter, as if the air itself had changed, and Emily followed, pausing just outside as if she knew Daniel was behind them without needing to turn. And when she finally did, her expression was the same, composed, steady, but there was something else there now, something quieter, something that acknowledged the moment without naming it, and Daniel stopped a few feet away, not too close, not distant, just present, and for a second none of them spoke, the city sounds filling the silence, cars passing, distant voices, the ordinary world continuing as if nothing had changed, even though everything had, and Lucas looked between them again, sensing the pause, the space that held meaning he could not yet understand, and then he looked up at Daniel. "Are you coming with us?" he asked, simple, direct, and the question settled into the space between them with a quiet weight, because it was not about distance or direction, it was about something else entirely, and Daniel glanced at Emily, not for permission but for clarity, and she held his gaze for a moment, just long enough before shaking her head slightly, not rejecting, not closing the door, just setting the boundary that still needed to exist, and Daniel nodded once, understanding, accepting. "Not today," he said gently, his voice calm, steady, and Lucas accepted that answer the same way he accepted everything else, without overthinking, without doubt, just a small nod, and then he reached for Emily's hand again, grounding himself in what he knew, and Emily gave Daniel one last look, not lingering, not uncertain, just clear, and then she turned, guiding Lucas down the sidewalk, their figures moving forward together, steady, unchanged, and Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, watching as the distance between them grew, not as something final, but as something that would need to be crossed over time, step by step, choice by choice, and as he finally turned back toward the clinic, the familiar structure of his life waiting inside, he understood that nothing about it would feel the same again, because for the first time, there was something beyond it that mattered more than control, more than certainty. Something that required him to show up, not once, not when it was convenient, but consistently, quietly, And as he walked back through those doors, he was no longer just returning to his work, he was stepping into a future that would ask more of him than he had ever been asked before. The clinic doors closed behind Daniel with a soft, controlled click, sealing him back into the world he understood, the world of schedules, charts, and decisions that followed clear lines. But even as he walked down the hallway, nothing aligned the way it had before, the familiar rhythm now disrupted by something quieter, something that did not belong to this place yet refused to leave him, and he returned to his office without speaking to anyone, his steps measured but not rushed, his mind no longer moving through tasks but replaying moments, small details that refused to fade, the way Lucas had looked at him without hesitation, the way Emily had spoken without raising her voice yet never losing control, the way both of them existed in a space he had never been part of. And when he reached his desk, he did not sit immediately, instead he stood there for a moment, looking at the clean surface, the organized files, the precision of a life built on predictability, and for the first time it felt incomplete, not lacking but limited, as if something essential had existed outside of it all. Along and slowly, he sat down, pulling the chart closer, not because he needed to review it, but because it was the only tangible link he had to what had just happened, his fingers resting on the edge of the paper before he turned the page again, reading the same details he already knew, but this time they carried weight. This was not just a patient history, this was a timeline he had not been part of, a record of years he could not revisit or correct, and he exhaled quietly, leaning back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window where the afternoon light filtered in, steady and indifferent, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to hold the clarity that had settled into him, because there was no confusion anymore, no uncertainty about what he had seen, only the understanding that what came next would not be defined by that moment alone, it would be defined by what he chose to do after it, and the thought did not overwhelm him, it steadied him because for the first time the path in front of him was not about achievement or control, it was about presence, something far less visible but far more demanding, and after a moment, he opened his eyes again, reaching for his phone, his movements deliberate, not impulsive, and he paused before dialing, not out of doubt but out of intention, knowing that every step from this point forward would matter in ways he had never measured before, and when he finally placed the call, his voice was calm, composed but different, carrying something new beneath it. "I need to adjust my schedule," he said simply, and the words, though small, marked a shift that extended beyond the day, beyond the clinic, beyond the life he had built, because for the first time, he was not arranging his time around what was expected, he was making space for something that required him to show up without guarantee, without control, and as he ended the call, placing the phone down with quiet certainty, he looked once more at the chart, not as a document but as a beginning, something that did not ask for perfection, only consistency, and Daniel understood then that what he had been given was not a second chance to fix the past, but a first chance to do something differently, something that would not be proven in words, but in the quiet, steady act of being there when it mattered most. The days that followed did not announce themselves with anything dramatic, no sudden changes, no visible shifts that anyone else in the clinic would notice, but for Daniel everything moved differently, measured not by appointments or meetings, but by moments that now held a different kind of importance, and true to his word, he adjusted his schedule, not once but repeatedly, creating space where there had never been space before, not for convenience but for consistency, and the first time Emily returned, it was not exactly 6 months later, but close enough, a routine kept with quiet precision, and when she walked through the clinic doors again, Lucas beside her, nothing about her posture suggested expectation, only calm readiness, the same composure she had carried before, and Daniel was already there, not waiting in a way that demanded attention, but present in a way that could not be missed, and when Lucas saw him, there was a flicker of recognition, small but real, a shift from stranger to something more familiar, and that was where it began, not with declarations, not with explanations, but with repetition, quiet, steady, and Daniel greeted them the same way he had practiced in his mind more times than he would admit, simple, calm, present, "Hi, Lucas," and the boy responded with the same ease, "Hi." No hesitation, no uncertainty, just acceptance growing in small increments, and Emily observed everything, not interfering, not guiding, just watching, her eyes taking in details that Daniel knew mattered more than anything he could say, and the appointment itself unfolded like any other routine on the surface, but layered beneath with something deeper, something built not in words, but in presence, and Daniel kept his distance where it mattered, never overstepping, never assuming, learning slowly where the lines were and how to respect them, and Lucas, in his natural way, began to fill the silence with questions, small ones at first, about the instruments, about the chart, about why doctors wore what they wore, and Daniel answered each one with patience, not as a performance, not to impress, but because the questions deserved answers, and Emily noticed that too, the way his tone never shifted, never rushed, never dismissed, and it was in those small exchanges that something began to take shape, something fragile but real, a connection that did not force itself forward, but grew quietly in the space that had been allowed. And when the appointment ended, Lucas did not say goodbye the same way this time. There was no title, no distance, just a small wave and a simple, "See you," and Daniel nodded, the word settling into him with more meaning than it should have carried, and Emily paused at the door again, just as she had before, but this time when she looked back, there was no question in her eyes, only acknowledgement, a silent recognition that something had changed, not completely, not permanently, but enough to be noticed, and Daniel did not try to hold the moment, did not try to extend it, he simply let it pass as it was, knowing that what mattered was not what happened in a single day, but what continued after it, and as the door closed behind them, the quiet returned, but it no longer felt empty, it felt like something had been placed there, something that would remain, something built not from promises, but from showing up again and again, until presence itself became the answer. Time did not announce the moment it changed everything, it never did, it moved quietly, steadily, through small decisions repeated often, enough to become something real, and over the months that followed, Daniel showed up not with grand gestures, not with words that tried to rewrite the past, but with presence, consistent, measured and patient, and Lucas began to recognize that presence not as something new, but as something expected, something that belonged, and it started in the smallest ways, a question asked without hesitation, a story shared without being prompted, a glance toward the door that no longer carried uncertainty, and Emily watched it all with the same quiet awareness she had always held, but something in her posture softened over time, not all at once, not in a single moment, but gradually, as if each visit placed another piece into a space that had once been closed, and Daniel never rushed that process, never assumed more than what was given, he listened more than he spoke, he stayed when it mattered, and when he left, he did not disappear, and one afternoon, nearly a year after that first unexpected meeting, the three of them stood together outside the clinic again, the air warmer this time, lighter, and Lucas looked up at Daniel with a familiarity that no longer needed to be explained. "Are you coming next time too?" he asked, his voice simple, but the meaning behind it steady, and Daniel did not hesitate, not because the answer was easy, but because it had already been proven. "Yes," he said, and the word carried weight not from promise, but from everything that had come before it, and Lucas nodded, satisfied in the way only a child could be, accepting what had already been shown to him, and Emily looked at Daniel then, really looked, not measuring, not questioning but seeing, and for the first time, there was no distance in her gaze, only acknowledgement, a quiet understanding that something had been rebuilt not by returning to the past, but by choosing differently in the present, and she gave a small nod, not dramatic, not emotional, just certain, and as they began to walk away, Lucas between them, holding Emily's hand with one and swinging the other freely, Daniel did not reach out, did not close the space too quickly, he simply walked beside them, matching their pace step by step, and in that quiet alignment, something settled into place, not perfect, not complete, but real, and as the city moved around them, unchanged, indifferent, the three of them moved forward in a rhythm that no longer felt uncertain, and the past, with all its silence and absence, remained where it belonged, not erased, not forgotten, but no longer in control, because some connections do not return to be explained, they return to be lived, one steady step at a time.